Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly, drop a comment below and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in and let's begin. The rusty iron bars of the Esperanza County jail cell cast jagged shadows across Deputy Lucien Beaumont's face as he swept his lantern through the cramped space where notorious outlaw Claude Thibodaux had been held before his mysterious death 3 nights earlier. The official cause listed as suicide despite suspicious circumstances that had left the entire town whispering about cover-ups and corruption that seemed to follow Sheriff Garrett Rousseau like buzzards circling wounded prey. The musty smell of fear and desperation still lingered in the small cell, mixing with the metallic scent of dried blood that stained the stone floor in patterns that suggested violence rather than self-inflicted death. While Lucien's systematic search for evidence that might explain the prisoner's fate was motivated by nagging doubts about official explanations that seemed designed to discourage investigation rather than provide truth. The loose stone in the wall behind the narrow cot was discovered purely by accident when Lucien's lantern flame flickered against what appeared to be mortar that had been recently disturbed, revealing a hiding place that prisoner had somehow created during his brief incarceration, despite constant supervision that should have prevented any opportunity for concealment of contraband or evidence that might compromise official version of events. The hidden compartment was barely large enough for a man's fist, but its contents would prove more explosive than dynamite in a town where trust in law enforcement was already fragile due to recent incidents involving missing evidence and suspicious deaths of witnesses whose testimony might have implicated respected citizens in criminal activities. The blood-stained letter that Lucien extracted from the stone cavity was written in shaky handwriting that suggested extreme duress or physical injury, while the brown stains that spotted the paper created grim testimony to circumstances under which final confession had been composed by a man who knew his death was imminent and wanted to leave record of truth that official authorities were determined to suppress through whatever means necessary. The paper itself was of good quality, suggesting that writer had access to materials not typically available to prisoners. While the ink appeared fresh, despite 3 days of concealment in damp stone hiding place that should have caused deterioration. The opening words of the letter struck Lucien like physical blows as he read accusations that challenged everything he believed about law enforcement and justice in Esperanza County, while detailed descriptions of criminal activities implicated Sheriff Rousseau in systematic corruption that included robbery, murder, and conspiracy with known outlaws whose crimes had terrorized territorial communities for months, while official investigations consistently failed to produce arrests or convictions despite abundant evidence and witness testimony that should have been sufficient for prosecution. The letter's claims that Sheriff Rousseau was actually the leader of outlaw gang that had been blamed on various scapegoats created foundation for understanding recent pattern of convenient deaths and disappearing evidence. When footsteps echoed in the jail corridor and Sheriff Rousseau's familiar voice called out asking about the deputy's activities in the cell block, Lucien quickly concealed the letter beneath his vest while fighting to control expression and voice that might betray discovery of evidence that could either expose massive corruption or destroy his career and possibly his life if powerful criminals learned that their secrets were no longer safe. The moment when Rousseau appeared in doorway with hand resting casually on his gun belt created tension that charged the air like approaching thunderstorm. While Lucien's stammered explanation about routine cleaning duties was accepted with suspicious scrutiny that suggested Sheriff's awareness that something significant had changed, despite careful attempt to maintain normal appearance and behavior that growing fear was making increasingly difficult to sustain. 2 months before discovering the hidden letter, Deputy Lucien Beaumont had arrived in Esperanza County, fresh from Territorial Law Enforcement Academy, with idealistic faith in justice system and profound respect for Sheriff Garrett Rousseau. whose reputation for maintaining order in lawless territory had made him legendary throughout southwestern regions, where effective law enforcement often meant the difference between civilization and chaos, that claimed communities whose citizens couldn't defend themselves against organized criminal activity. Lucien's assignment as deputy was considered prestigious opportunity for a young officer whose academic performance and moral character had impressed instructors who recommended him for service under sheriff, whose experience and success provided excellent training environment for developing professional competence. The first incident that planted seeds of doubt occurred during bank robbery investigation, where evidence seemed to disappear from sheriff's office between collection and trial, while witness testimony was systematically discredited through personal attacks that destroyed credibility of honest citizens whose accounts contradicted official theory about crime that conveniently implicated deceased suspect who could not defend himself against posthumous accusations. Lucien's questions about missing evidence and investigative procedures were dismissed as inexperience and naivety, while his suggestions for more thorough investigation were rejected with explanations about political pressure and limited resources that required expedient resolution of cases regardless of minor inconsistencies. The pattern that began emerging through subsequent cases included systematic failure to apprehend known criminals despite detailed intelligence about their locations and activities, while arrests that did occur typically involved petty offenders or convenient scapegoats whose prosecution provided appearance of effective law enforcement without actually disrupting organized criminal operations that continued flourishing under protection that official corruption seemed to provide through selective enforcement and mysterious evidence problems. The coincidence of timing between major crimes and sheriff's unexplained absences from town began creating uncomfortable questions that Lucien was afraid to voice directly. The conversation that Lucien overheard between Sheriff Rousseau and mysterious visitor late one evening at jail office included references to payment schedules and territorial divisions that sounded more like criminal conspiracy than legitimate law enforcement business, while coded language and careful references to unnamed associates suggested systematic coordination with criminal elements whose activities should have been primary target of sheriff's investigation rather than source of apparent cooperation and mutual benefit. The visitor's departure through back exit and careful avoidance of Main Street created impression of secrecy that legitimate business would not require. The accumulation of suspicious incidents and unexplained coincidences had gradually eroded Lucien's faith in his superior's integrity while creating dangerous situation where junior officers' growing awareness of corruption threatened to expose systematic criminal conspiracy that had penetrated highest levels of territorial law enforcement, making him potential target for elimination by criminals whose success depended on maintaining official protection through purchased loyalty or intimidated silence. When Claude Thibodaux' arrest provided opportunity for prisoner to reveal incriminating information about criminal organization, his sudden death under suspicious circumstances represented either tragic suicide or calculated murder designed to prevent testimony that could destroy carefully constructed facade of legitimate law enforcement that served criminal interests rather than public welfare. The arrest of Claude Thibodaux had occurred under circumstances that seemed almost too convenient for Sheriff Rousseau's reputation, as notorious Outlaw was captured during raid on hideout that had been known to law enforcement for months, but mysteriously avoided during previous operations that always arrived just after criminals had abandoned locations whose security had been mysteriously compromised by information leaks that seemed to originate from official sources. Thibodaux' capture was accomplished without resistance from man whose reputation for violent defense suggested either cowardice or deliberate surrender that served purposes other than simple desire to avoid bloodshed during confrontation with territorial law enforcement. The prisoner's behavior during interrogation was characterized by a mixture of defiance and desperation that suggested internal conflict between loyalty to criminal associates and growing awareness that his usefulness to organization had been exhausted through capture that might have been deliberately arranged by leaders who considered him expendable liability, whose testimony could threaten more valuable members of conspiracy that included law enforcement officials whose protection was essential for continued criminal operations. His repeated requests for private conversation with federal authorities were denied by Sheriff Rousseau, who insisted that territorial jurisdiction was adequate for handling case despite prisoners' obvious fear of local officials. The evidence that was recovered from Thibodaux's possession included detailed records of criminal activities that implicated numerous territorial citizens in conspiracy that exceeded simple outlaw gang into systematic criminal enterprise, with connections to political and business leaders whose respectability provided cover for illegal operations that generated enormous profits through robbery, extortion, and systematic corruption of territorial governance. The documentation suggested organizational structure and resource allocation that required sophisticated planning and coordination that individual outlaw leader could not have accomplished without assistance from persons with official authority and social position. The mysterious illness that struck Thibodaux during his second night in custody was initially attributed to contaminated food or natural disease, but his rapid deterioration and specific symptoms suggested poisoning by substance that would be difficult to detect without specialized medical examination, that territorial resources could not provide despite prisoners' obvious distress and systematic failure of conventional treatment that jail physician attempted through standard remedies for common ailments. The prisoner's final hours were marked by delirium and apparent hallucinations that included references to betrayal and systematic deception by trusted associates. The death that was officially ruled suicide occurred under circumstances that made self-inflicted injury virtually impossible given prisoners' physical condition and constant supervision that should have prevented access to means of self-destruction. While absence of suicide note or previous indication of suicidal intention created suspicion among community members who had expected trial to reveal information about criminal conspiracy that might have implicated respected citizens whose reputations and political influence made them valuable assets for criminal organization whose success depended on maintaining legitimate facade that official corruption could provide through selective law enforcement and systematic suppression of evidence that threatened powerful criminals. The systematic review that Lucien conducted of recent criminal cases revealed pattern of evidence tampering and witness intimidation that suggested coordinated effort to protect criminal organization through official corruption that extended beyond simple bribery into active participation by law enforcement officials whose authority was being used to facilitate rather than prevent criminal activity throughout territorial region where organized crime was systematically undermining legitimate governance and citizen safety. The files that were accessible to deputies showed obvious gaps and alterations that indicated systematic removal of incriminating evidence that might have connected recent crimes to broader conspiracy. The financial records that Lucien discovered during routine filing revealed Sheriff Rousseau's lifestyle exceeded salary that territorial law enforcement provided to even senior officials, while unexplained income sources and expensive purchases suggested additional revenue that honest law enforcement work could not generate through legitimate means available to territorial peace officers whose compensation was limited by public budget constraints and taxpayer resistance to increased government spending on law enforcement that many citizens considered adequate for community needs, despite rising crime rates and systematic failure to apprehend known criminals. The communication patterns that Lucien observed between sheriff and certain community members included coded messages and secretive meetings that seemed designed to avoid public scrutiny, while coordinating activities that legitimate law enforcement business would not require concealment from deputy, whose official duties should have included awareness of all significant investigations and enforcement operations that territorial jurisdiction encompassed. The exclusion of junior officer from important cases and sensitive operations created isolation that prevented comprehensive understanding of departmental activities while limiting his ability to assess ethical implications of policies and procedures. The timing analysis that Lucien performed on major crimes and law enforcement response revealed systematic pattern of delayed response and misdirected investigation that consistently allowed criminal perpetrators to escape apprehension while providing appearance of diligent law enforcement effort that satisfied public expectations without actually threatening criminal operations, whose success depended on advance warning and official protection that corrupt law enforcement could provide through selective information sharing and strategic incompetence that protected valuable criminal assets while maintaining facade of professional competence. The realization that was crystallizing through accumulated evidence suggested that Sheriff Rousseau was not simply corrupt official accepting bribes from criminal organization, but active leader of systematic criminal conspiracy that used legitimate law enforcement authority as cover for illegal operations that generated enormous profits while eliminating competition through official suppression and strategic prosecution of independent criminals whose activities threatened organized crime's territorial control and profit margins, that required monopolistic domination of illegal activities throughout regional jurisdiction that official authority could protect through systematic abuse of public trust and constitutional responsibility. The decision that confronted Lucien after discovering the bloodstained letter involved choosing between personal safety and professional obligation to expose criminal conspiracy that included his immediate superior and potentially other officials whose authority could destroy his career and possibly his life if they learned about evidence that threatened systematic criminal operations whose success depended on maintaining official protection through corrupt law enforcement that served criminal interests rather than public welfare and constitutional law that territorial governance was supposed to uphold through honest administration and effective crime prevention. The isolation that his growing awareness created was intensified by recognition that community members who might support honest law enforcement could also be compromised by criminal intimidation or financial incentives that made trustworthy allies difficult to identify among citizens whose apparent respectability might conceal criminal association or purchased loyalty that served organized crime's need for community support and information about potential threats to criminal operations that required advance warning for successful evasion of legitimate law enforcement efforts that honest officials might attempt, despite systematic corruption. The evidence preservation that became Lucien's immediate priority required careful concealment of letter and supporting documentation from persons whose authority provided access to official files and physical evidence that criminal conspiracy would eliminate if discovery threatened exposure of criminal activities that had been successfully concealed through official corruption and systematic suppression of incriminating evidence that previous investigations had uncovered before convenient disappearance of witnesses and documentation that might have supported prosecution of criminal organization whose political influence exceeded territorial law enforcement capacity. The strategic planning that circumstances demanded included development of communication with federal authorities whose jurisdiction and resources could address criminal conspiracy that exceeded territorial capability for investigation and prosecution of organized crime that included law enforcement officials whose corruption made local justice system unreliable for achieving accountability and punishment that constitutional law required for maintaining legitimate governance and citizen protection against systematic criminal predation that was threatening territorial development and democratic institutions that frontier communities needed for successful incorporation into American constitutional framework. The personal cost that exposing criminal conspiracy would exact from young deputy included probable loss of career and possible physical danger from criminals whose survival depended on maintaining secrecy about operations that official exposure could destroy through federal investigation and prosecution that would eliminate criminal organization while also ending lucrative corruption that had provided illegal income for law enforcement officials whose betrayal of public trust represented fundamental violation of constitutional oath and professional responsibility that democratic governance required from persons whose authority served public welfare rather than private criminal enterprise that threatened community safety. The complete text of Claude Thibodaux's final confession revealed scope of criminal conspiracy that exceeded Lucien's worst suspicions about corruption in territorial law enforcement, while detailed descriptions of specific crimes included dates, locations, and participant names that provided comprehensive intelligence about systematic criminal operations that had been conducted under official protection for over 2 years through coordination between outlaw gang and law enforcement officials, whose authority was used to facilitate rather than prevent illegal activities that generated enormous profits for criminal organization, whose membership included respected community leaders. The organizational structure that was described in prisoners' dying testimony included Sheriff Rousseau as operational commander of criminal enterprise that coordinated various illegal activities through systematic abuse of law enforcement authority, while other officials and prominent citizens served specific functions within conspiracy that required their particular skills and social positions for maintaining legitimate facade that concealed criminal operations from federal investigation and public suspicion that might have threatened profitable enterprises whose success depended on community trust and official protection that corruption had purchased through bribery and intimidation. The specific crimes that were documented in Bloodstained confession included systematic robbery of mining shipments, cattle rustling operations, extortion of local businesses, and murder of witnesses whose testimony threatened criminal conspiracy, while detailed accounts of Sheriff Rousseau's personal participation in violent crimes provided evidence that exceeded simple corruption into territory involving systematic predation on territorial citizens whose safety and property were supposed to be protected by law enforcement officials whose constitutional oath required service to public welfare rather than private criminal enterprise that threatened democratic governance and legitimate business. The financial records that prisoner had maintained included detailed accounting of criminal profits and distribution among conspiracy members, while documentation of payments to various officials and community leaders revealed scope of corruption that extended beyond law enforcement into territorial government and business community whose cooperation was essential for maintaining systematic criminal operations that required legitimate facade and official protection for continued success, despite obvious impact on community welfare and territorial development that honest governance was supposed to promote through effective law enforcement. The warning that concluded prisoner's confession included urgent plea for federal intervention to stop criminal conspiracy before planned expansion into neighboring territories where similar corruption of law enforcement could establish criminal empire that would threaten regional development and democratic institutions whose protection required immediate action by honest officials, whose authority exceeded local jurisdiction, and whose resources could address organized crime that territorial law enforcement could not investigate due to systematic corruption that made local justice system unreliable for achieving accountability and punishment, that constitutional law demanded for protecting citizen rights and community welfare. The identification of potential allies among community members required careful assessment of individual character and possible criminal association that made approaching wrong person potentially fatal for deputy whose discovery of incriminating evidence created immediate danger from criminal organization whose survival depended on preventing exposure of systematic corruption that had protected profitable illegal operations for years through purchased loyalty and systematic intimidation of honest citizens whose cooperation was essential for maintaining facade of legitimate law enforcement that served criminal interests rather than public welfare and constitutional responsibility. The approach that Lucien made to Dr. Elizabeth Moreau, whose medical practice provided insight into suspicious deaths and injuries that might have resulted from criminal violence, was conducted with extreme caution due to recognition that even respected professionals could be compromised by criminal intimidation or financial incentives that made trustworthy allies difficult to identify among citizens whose apparent integrity might conceal criminal association or purchased silence that served organized crime's need for community cooperation and information about potential threats to criminal operations that required advance warning for successful concealment. The conversation that developed between deputy and physician revealed shared suspicions about recent deaths and injuries that seemed inconsistent with official explanations. While her professional knowledge provided medical evidence that supported conclusions about systematic violence and criminal activity that official investigations had dismissed as accidents or natural causes, despite clear indications of deliberate harm that conventional medical examination could identify, if conducted without political pressure or criminal intimidation, that might influence diagnostic conclusions and official documentation that served criminal interests rather than medical accuracy. The alliance that was formed through mutual recognition of criminal conspiracy created foundation for systematic intelligence gathering and evidence preservation that could support federal investigation, while Dr. Moreau's access to community information and medical records provided comprehensive understanding of criminal impact on territorial citizens whose safety and welfare had been systematically compromised by law enforcement corruption that protected criminal predators rather than their innocent victims whose suffering demanded accountability and justice that local authorities could not provide due to systematic corruption. The communication system that was established for sharing information and coordinating response to criminal threats included coded messages and secure meeting locations that could provide protection from surveillance by criminal organization whose success depended on monitoring potential opposition while eliminating threats through intimidation or violence that official authority could facilitate through apparent legal process that concealed criminal motivation behind facade of legitimate law enforcement action that served private criminal enterprise rather than public welfare and constitutional governance that territorial citizens deserved from honest officials. The decision to contact federal authorities required careful planning and secure communication that could avoid detection by criminal organization whose infiltration of territorial law enforcement made normal official channels unreliable for transmitting sensitive intelligence that could expose systematic corruption, while requesting federal intervention that would threaten criminal operations, whose success depended on maintaining official protection through purchased loyalty and systematic intimidation of honest officials who might attempt to fulfill constitutional obligations despite personal danger that opposing organized crime could create for law enforcement officers and their families. The journey that Lucien undertook to reach federal marshal's office in territorial capital required elaborate deception about official duties and personal travel that could explain extended absence from normal patrol responsibilities without arousing suspicion from Sheriff Rousseau, whose monitoring of deputy activities had become increasingly systematic, as criminal organization recognized potential threat from honest law enforcement officer whose integrity and investigative capability could expose systematic corruption that protected profitable illegal operations from legitimate prosecution and punishment that constitutional law required. The meeting that was arranged with Federal Marshal Thomas Beauregard was conducted with extreme security precautions due to recognition that criminal conspiracy included intelligence network that monitored federal activities and law enforcement personnel whose investigation could threaten organized crime, whose political influence and financial resources exceeded territorial capability for resistance through conventional law enforcement channels that corruption had compromised. The marshals' experience with territorial corruption provided foundation for understanding scope of criminal conspiracy that required federal intervention for successful investigation and prosecution. The evidence that Lucien presented included Thibodaux's bloodstained confession, along with supporting documentation that had been gathered through systematic observation of criminal activities and law enforcement corruption, while comprehensive analysis of suspicious incidents and criminal patterns provided intelligence that exceeded anything federal authorities had previously obtained about organized crime in territorial regions where systematic corruption made reliable information difficult to acquire through normal investigative channels, that criminal organizations monitored and influenced through purchased cooperation from official sources. The federal response that was promised included immediate covert investigation and gradual deployment of federal resources for addressing criminal conspiracy without alerting criminal organization to federal awareness of systematic corruption, while protection for honest local officials required careful coordination and strategic timing that could preserve evidence while ensuring personal safety for witnesses whose testimony would be essential for successful prosecution of criminal enterprise, whose elimination required systematic federal intervention that exceeded territorial law enforcement capability due to widespread corruption and criminal infiltration of legitimate governmental institutions. The trap that was carefully planned between Lucien and federal authorities required maintaining appearance of normal law enforcement routine while systematically gathering additional evidence and identifying all participants in criminal conspiracy whose prosecution would require comprehensive intelligence about organizational structure and individual criminal activity that could support federal charges against entire criminal enterprise rather than limited prosecution of individual criminals whose conviction might not eliminate systematic corruption that threatened territorial governance and citizen welfare through continued operation of organized crime under different leadership. The surveillance operation that was implemented through federal resources included systematic monitoring of Sheriff Rousseau and suspected criminal associates whose activities were documented through advanced investigative techniques that territorial law enforcement did not possess, due to limited resources and systematic corruption that made conventional investigation unreliable for gathering evidence against criminal organization whose success depended on maintaining official protection through purchased loyalty and systematic intimidation of honest officials who might attempt to fulfill constitutional responsibilities despite personal danger. The coordination that was established between federal agents and honest local officials required careful communication and strategic timing that could prevent criminal organization from detecting federal investigation while ensuring that evidence gathering proceeded according to plan that would maximize prosecutorial success while minimizing danger to undercover personnel whose exposure could result in violent retaliation from criminal enterprise whose survival depended on eliminating threats through intimidation or murder that official authority could facilitate through apparent legal process. The pressure that was gradually applied through systematic investigation began creating tension within criminal organization as members recognized increased federal attention and law enforcement scrutiny that threatened profitable operations whose success had depended on territorial corruption and lack of effective oversight from higher authorities whose resources and jurisdiction could address organized crime that local law enforcement could not investigate due to systematic corruption and criminal infiltration of legitimate governmental institutions that served private criminal enterprise rather than public welfare. The critical moment that was approaching required perfect timing and coordination between federal and local authorities whose joint operation would either successfully expose and eliminate criminal conspiracy or alert criminal organization to federal investigation that could result in systematic destruction of evidence and violent elimination of witnesses whose testimony was essential for prosecution of organized crime, whose political influence and financial resources exceeded normal criminal capability for resistance against legitimate law enforcement action that constitutional authority required for protecting citizen rights and territorial governance. The changes in Sheriff Rousseau's behavior became increasingly apparent as federal investigation proceeded according to plan that required maintaining secrecy while gathering comprehensive evidence about criminal conspiracy. While his growing paranoia and systematic monitoring of deputy activities suggested awareness that something significant had changed, despite careful attempts to maintain normal appearance and routine activities that concealed covert cooperation with federal authorities whose intervention was essential for addressing organized crime that territorial corruption had protected through systematic abuse of official authority and constitutional responsibility. The incidents that began occurring with increased frequency included mysterious equipment failures and communication problems that seemed designed to isolate honest law enforcement officers while preventing effective coordination with federal authorities whose investigation required reliable intelligence and systematic cooperation from local officials whose safety depended on maintaining cover story that concealed federal involvement in addressing territorial corruption. The pattern of interference suggested sophisticated counterintelligence capability that exceeded normal criminal organization resources through possible assistance from corrupt officials. The threats that were communicated through indirect channels included warnings about consequences of disloyalty and systematic investigation of personal background and family connections that could provide leverage for criminal intimidation. While escalating pressure on honest officials demonstrated criminal organizations' desperation and recognition that their profitable operations were threatened by federal attention that could eliminate systematic corruption and official protection that had enabled illegal activities to flourish without effective law enforcement intervention or constitutional accountability that democratic governance required. The evidence that continued accumulating through federal surveillance revealed scope of criminal enterprise that exceeded initial estimates about territorial corruption. While documentation of systematic criminal activity included murder, robbery, extortion, and political corruption that challenged fundamental assumptions about law enforcement integrity and governmental effectiveness in frontier regions where organized crime had successfully infiltrated legitimate institutions through bribery and intimidation that exceeded normal territorial capability for resistance through conventional means. The moment when Sheriff Rousseau directly confronted Lucien about his recent activities and travel patterns created immediate crisis that tested carefully planned cover story while revealing criminal organizations' awareness that federal investigation was proceeding despite attempts to maintain secrecy about cooperation between honest local officials and federal authorities whose intervention represented existential threat to profitable criminal operations, whose success depended on maintaining territorial corruption and official protection that systematic abuse of law enforcement authority had provided for years. The accusation that Sheriff Rousseau made about Lucien's loyalty and recent suspicious behavior was accompanied by direct threats that exceeded normal disciplinary authority through implications of violence and systematic retaliation that could affect family members and personal safety in ways that official law enforcement position should not have enabled, but which criminal organization could accomplish through resources and connections that extended beyond legitimate governmental authority into territory involving systematic intimidation and potential murder of honest officials whose integrity threatened profitable illegal operations. The response that Lucien provided required careful balance between maintaining cover story and avoiding direct lies that might be easily detected through criminal organizations' intelligence network, while his attempt to explain recent activities and travel patterns was complicated by recognition that any inconsistency could expose federal investigation and cooperation that represented his only protection against criminal retaliation that was becoming increasingly likely as tensions escalated within conspiracy whose survival depended on eliminating threats to systematic corruption. The investigation that Sheriff Rousseau announced into deputies' recent activities included systematic review of official duties and personal associations that could reveal federal contact and cooperative investigation, while his access to law enforcement resources and criminal intelligence network provided capability for detecting deception and exposing federal intervention that would eliminate honest officials' only protection against violent retaliation from organized crime, whose desperation was increasing as evidence accumulated against criminal conspiracy that included multiple murders and systematic corruption. The time pressure that was created by escalating criminal suspicion required immediate acceleration of federal operation that had been planned for gradual implementation over several weeks, while necessity for preserving evidence and protecting honest officials demanded strategic decisions about timing and coordination that could either successfully expose criminal conspiracy or result in systematic destruction of evidence and violent elimination of witnesses whose testimony was essential for prosecution of organized crime that threatened territorial governance and citizen welfare. The communication that was established with federal authorities through emergency channels included urgent requests for immediate intervention and witness protection that could preserve evidence while ensuring personal safety for honest officials whose exposure would certainly result in violent retaliation from criminal organization whose survival depended on maintaining secrecy about systematic corruption and criminal activities that federal prosecution could eliminate through constitutional law enforcement that territorial authorities could not provide due to widespread corruption and criminal infiltration of legitimate governmental institutions. The discovery that Sheriff Rousseau made about Lucien's federal contact was accomplished through systematic surveillance and intelligence gathering that revealed criminal organizations' sophisticated counterintelligence capability, while his confrontation with Deputy about unauthorized communication with federal authorities created immediate crisis that threatened to expose entire federal investigation while endangering honest officials whose cooperation had been essential for gathering evidence about systematic corruption and criminal conspiracy that exceeded territorial law enforcement capability for investigation and prosecution through conventional means. The trap that had been carefully planned by federal authorities was compromised by criminal organizations' awareness of federal investigation. While Sheriff Rousseau's systematic preparation for eliminating threats included coordination with criminal associates whose resources and violence capability exceeded normal territorial law enforcement ability for protection of honest officials whose testimony was essential for prosecution of organized crime that had infiltrated legitimate governmental institutions through systematic corruption and intimidation that served private criminal enterprise rather than public welfare. The decision that federal authorities made about immediate intervention was forced by circumstances that no longer allowed gradual investigation and evidence gathering, while emergency deployment of federal resources required coordination with territorial officials whose loyalty was uncertain due to systematic corruption that made reliable allies difficult to identify among law enforcement personnel and governmental authorities whose cooperation was essential for successful operation against criminal conspiracy that included multiple murders and systematic abuse of official authority. The warning that was received through emergency communication channels included intelligence about planned elimination of honest officials and systematic destruction of evidence that could support prosecution of criminal organization, while timing of criminal retaliation required immediate federal response that could protect witnesses and preserve evidence despite criminal organizations' awareness of federal investigation and their desperate attempt to eliminate threats through violence and intimidation that exceeded normal criminal capability through official authority and systematic corruption. The moment when federal marshals arrived in Esperanza County created immediate confrontation between legitimate law enforcement and criminal conspiracy that had infiltrated territorial government, while Sheriff Rousseau's reaction to federal intervention revealed desperation and criminal organizations' recognition that their systematic corruption and profitable illegal operations were threatened by constitutional law enforcement that could eliminate organized crime through prosecution and punishment that territorial authorities could not provide due to widespread corruption and criminal infiltration of legitimate institutions. The arrival of federal marshals in Esperanza County was coordinated through systematic operation that included simultaneous deployment at multiple locations where criminal conspiracy members were conducting business or residing. While comprehensive federal response demonstrated resources and authority that exceeded territorial law enforcement capability for addressing organized crime whose systematic corruption had made local justice system unreliable for constitutional law enforcement and citizen protection that democratic governance required through honest administration and effective crime prevention that served public welfare rather than private criminal enterprise. The arrests that were accomplished through federal operation included Sheriff Rousseau and multiple criminal associates whose systematic criminal activities had been documented through covert investigation and evidence provided by honest officials, whose cooperation had been essential for exposing organizational structure and individual criminal responsibility that federal prosecution required for eliminating entire criminal enterprise rather than limited conviction of individual criminals whose replacement would not address systematic corruption that threatened territorial governance and constitutional authority. The evidence that was secured through federal raids included comprehensive documentation of criminal activities and financial records that revealed scope of systematic corruption and criminal conspiracy, while seizure of weapons and criminal assets provided additional intelligence about organizational capability and resources that had enabled criminal enterprise to maintain profitable operations through official protection and systematic intimidation of honest citizens whose cooperation had been purchased through bribery or obtained through violence that exceeded normal criminal activity. The resistance that was encountered during federal operation included armed confrontation from criminal associates who recognized that capture would result in prosecution and imprisonment that would eliminate their profitable illegal activities, while systematic violence and attempted escape demonstrated criminal organizations' desperation and recognition that federal intervention represented existential threat to systematic corruption that had protected organized crime from constitutional law enforcement and legitimate prosecution that territorial authorities could not provide due to widespread criminal infiltration. The victory that was achieved through successful federal operation eliminated criminal conspiracy while preserving evidence and protecting honest officials whose courage and cooperation had been essential for exposing systematic corruption and criminal activities that threatened territorial development and democratic institutions, while prosecution of criminal organization through federal courts would provide accountability and punishment that constitutional law required for protecting citizen rights and community welfare against organized crime that had systematically violated public trust and official responsibility. The trial that followed federal arrests provided public revelation of systematic corruption and criminal conspiracy that had infiltrated territorial law enforcement and governmental institutions, while comprehensive evidence presentation included testimony from honest officials and criminal associates whose cooperation with federal investigation exposed organizational structure and individual criminal responsibility that exceeded community understanding about scope of organized crime that had been systematically preying on territorial citizens through official protection and systematic abuse of constitutional authority. The testimony that Claude Thibodaux had provided through his blood-stained confession was corroborated by federal investigation and additional evidence that confirmed prisoners' accusations about Sheriff Rousseau's leadership of criminal organization, while detailed documentation of specific crimes included murder, robbery, extortion, and systematic corruption that challenged fundamental assumptions about law enforcement integrity and governmental effectiveness in protecting citizen rights and community welfare through constitutional law enforcement and legitimate prosecution of criminal activity. The community response to revelation of systematic corruption included shock and anger about betrayal of public trust by officials whose constitutional oath required service to public welfare rather than private criminal enterprise, while recognition that respected law enforcement officer had been criminal organization leader created crisis of confidence in governmental institutions and democratic governance that required systematic reform and renewed commitment to constitutional principles that protected citizen rights against systematic predation by organized crime and corrupt officials. The justice that was achieved through federal prosecution included conviction and imprisonment of criminal conspiracy members whose systematic criminal activities had threatened territorial development and democratic institutions, while punishment that was imposed through federal courts demonstrated constitutional law enforcement capability for addressing organized crime that territorial authorities could not investigate or prosecute due to systematic corruption and criminal infiltration that had made local justice system unreliable for protecting public welfare and citizen rights. The reform that was implemented through federal oversight included systematic review of territorial law enforcement and governmental institutions whose corruption had enabled criminal conspiracy to flourish, while appointment of honest officials and implementation of accountability measures provided foundation for legitimate governance and effective law enforcement that could serve public welfare through constitutional authority rather than private criminal enterprise that threatened democratic institutions and community safety through systematic abuse of official responsibility and public trust. The recognition that Lucien received for his courage and integrity in exposing criminal conspiracy included federal commendation and appointment to permanent position in territorial law enforcement, whose reform required honest officials whose commitment to constitutional principles exceeded personal safety and career advancement, that criminal intimidation might threaten through systematic retaliation against honest law enforcement officers whose integrity challenged systematic corruption and organized crime that had infiltrated legitimate governmental institutions through bribery and violence. The vindication that was provided through successful prosecution of criminal organization confirmed accuracy of suspicions and investigative conclusions that had motivated dangerous cooperation with federal authorities despite personal risk and professional isolation that challenging corrupt superior officer had created through systematic intimidation and criminal threats that exceeded normal law enforcement disciplinary authority through official position that served criminal enterprise rather than public welfare and constitutional responsibility that democratic governance required. The community respect that was earned through demonstrated courage and professional integrity created foundation for continued law enforcement service in reformed territorial government whose effectiveness required citizen cooperation and public trust, that systematic corruption had systematically undermined through criminal conspiracy, whose elimination enabled restoration of legitimate governance and constitutional law enforcement that served community welfare rather than private criminal criminal interests that threatened democratic institutions and territorial development through organized predation on honest citizens. The career advancement that was offered through federal recognition of professional competence and moral character provided opportunities for continued service to constitutional law enforcement and territorial development that required honest officials whose integrity exceeded personal considerations about safety and advancement that criminal intimidation might threaten through systematic retaliation against law enforcement officers whose commitment to public welfare challenged organized crime and systematic corruption that violated public trust and constitutional authority. The satisfaction that was achieved through successful exposure of criminal conspiracy and protection of innocent citizens whose safety had been threatened by systematic corruption provided personal fulfillment that exceeded professional advancement through recognition that individual courage and moral integrity could challenge organized crime and systematic abuse of official authority when supported by constitutional law enforcement and federal resources that exceeded territorial capability for addressing criminal conspiracy that threatened democratic institutions and community welfare. The escape attempt that Sheriff Rousseau made during transport to federal courthouse was coordinated with remaining criminal associates whose desperate effort to prevent prosecution represented final threat to constitutional law enforcement and community safety that federal authorities had systematically addressed through comprehensive operation against organized crime. While violent confrontation that resulted from attempted rescue demonstrated criminal organizations' recognition that conviction would eliminate profitable illegal operations and systematic corruption that had protected criminal conspiracy from legitimate prosecution and punishment that democratic governance required. The manhunt that was conducted through coordinated federal and territorial law enforcement demonstrated reformed capability for effective crime prevention and constitutional authority that honest officials could provide when systematic corruption was eliminated through federal intervention and appointment of law enforcement personnel whose integrity exceeded personal considerations about safety and career advancement that criminal intimidation had previously used for maintaining official protection and preventing legitimate investigation of organized crime that threatened community welfare. The final confrontation between federal authorities and escaped criminal leader was conducted in territory where Sheriff Rousseau had previously enjoyed systematic protection from criminal associates and corrupted officials, while his desperate attempt to evade constitutional law enforcement revealed recognition that federal prosecution would result in conviction and imprisonment that would eliminate his criminal career and expose remaining criminal associates whose cooperation with organized crime had systematically violated public trust and constitutional responsibility that democratic governance required for protecting citizen rights. The capture that was accomplished through superior federal resources and coordination demonstrated constitutional law enforcement capability for addressing organized crime that exceeded normal territorial criminal activity through systematic corruption and official protection, while Sheriff Rousseau's arrest completed elimination of criminal conspiracy whose systematic predation on territorial citizens had threatened democratic institutions and community development through organized violation of public trust and constitutional authority that legitimate governance was supposed to provide. The victory that was achieved through successful federal operation against systematic corruption and organized crime provided foundation for restored confidence in democratic institutions and constitutional law enforcement that could serve public welfare through honest administration and effective crime prevention, while elimination of criminal conspiracy whose infiltration of governmental institutions had threatened territorial development created opportunity for legitimate governance and community progress that honest officials could provide through commitment to constitutional principles rather than private criminal enterprise. The trial that concluded federal prosecution of criminal conspiracy provided comprehensive public revelation of systematic corruption and criminal activities that had infiltrated territorial law enforcement and governmental institutions, while detailed testimony and evidence presentation demonstrated scope of organized crime that had systematically violated public trust and constitutional authority through official positions that served private criminal enterprise rather than community welfare and democratic governance that territorial citizens deserved from honest officials whose oath required service to constitutional principles. The conviction that was achieved through federal prosecution included maximum sentences for criminal conspiracy leaders whose systematic criminal activities had included murder, robbery, extortion, and corruption of governmental institutions, while punishment that was imposed through constitutional law enforcement demonstrated democratic society's capability for addressing organized crime through legitimate judicial process, rather than vigilante justice that frontier conditions sometimes produced when legitimate law enforcement was inadequate for protecting citizen rights and community welfare against systematic criminal predation. The restitution that was ordered through federal court included financial compensation for victims of criminal conspiracy whose systematic predation had caused individual suffering and community damage that exceeded normal criminal activity through organized violation of public trust and constitutional authority, while seizure of criminal assets provided resources for community restoration and victim assistance that could address systematic harm that organized crime had inflicted on territorial development and democratic institutions through corruption and violence. The reform that was implemented through federal oversight included systematic review and reconstruction of territorial law enforcement and governmental institutions whose corruption had enabled criminal conspiracy to flourish, while appointment of honest officials and implementation of accountability measures provided foundation for legitimate governance that could serve public welfare through constitutional authority rather than private criminal interests that threatened democratic institutions and community safety through systematic abuse of official responsibility. The precedent that was established through successful federal prosecution of systematic corruption and organized crime created framework for future law enforcement operations that could prevent development of similar criminal conspiracies through early detection and intervention that protected democratic institutions and community welfare against systematic predation by organized crime, whose success depended on corrupting legitimate governmental authority through bribery and intimidation that federal oversight and constitutional law enforcement could prevent through systematic accountability. The restoration that began in Esperanza County following elimination of criminal conspiracy included systematic rebuilding of public trust and confidence in governmental institutions whose corruption had been eliminated through federal intervention, while appointment of honest officials and implementation of transparent accountability measures provided foundation for legitimate governance that could serve community welfare through constitutional authority rather than private criminal interests that had systematically exploited territorial citizens through organized crime and official corruption that violated public trust. The reconciliation that was necessary among community members whose cooperation with criminal organization had been motivated by intimidation rather than criminal intent included forgiveness and understanding for persons whose survival had required accommodation with systematic corruption that threatened individual safety and family welfare, while distinction between voluntary criminal participation and coerced cooperation enabled community healing that could restore social cohesion and mutual trust that democratic institutions required for effective governance and citizen cooperation. The economic recovery that followed elimination of systematic criminal predation included restoration of legitimate business activity and community development that had been systematically suppressed by organized crime, whose extortion and intimidation had prevented normal economic growth and territorial progress, while seizure of criminal assets provided resources for infrastructure improvement and public services that could support community welfare and democratic institutions through legitimate governmental authority rather than criminal exploitation. The social development that was enabled through restored law enforcement and honest governance included educational and cultural institutions that could serve community needs while promoting democratic values and constitutional principles that systematic corruption had systematically undermined through criminal conspiracy, whose success had depended on maintaining public ignorance and social division that prevented effective resistance to organized crime and governmental corruption that violated citizen rights and community welfare. The hope that was restored through successful federal intervention and elimination of criminal conspiracy provided foundation for continued territorial development and democratic governance that could serve future generations, whose welfare depended on maintaining constitutional principles and effective law enforcement that protected community safety and citizen rights against systematic predation by organized crime, whose prevention required continued vigilance and commitment to honest administration that served public welfare rather than private criminal enterprise. The leadership that Lucien provided in reformed territorial law enforcement included systematic training and professional development that could prevent future corruption through education about constitutional principles and ethical responsibility that democratic governance required from officials whose authority served public welfare rather than private interests. While his experience with exposing criminal conspiracy provided valuable knowledge for detecting and preventing systematic corruption that threatened legitimate governmental institutions and community safety through organized crime and official misconduct. The partnership that was developed between territorial and federal law enforcement created ongoing cooperation and oversight that could address criminal threats that exceeded local capability while maintaining constitutional authority and community autonomy that democratic governance required for effective citizen representation and local control over governmental decisions that affected community welfare and territorial development through legitimate political process, rather than criminal manipulation and systematic corruption. The family that Lucien established through marriage to Dr. Elizabeth Moreau represented personal fulfillment and community stability that honest law enforcement and reformed governance could provide through protection of citizen rights and social institutions that supported individual happiness and family welfare, while their continued professional service to community health and safety demonstrated commitment to public welfare that exceeded personal considerations about advancement and recognition that career success might provide. The legacy that was being created through honest law enforcement and reformed governmental institutions included educational and social programs that could serve future generations whose welfare depended on maintaining constitutional principles and effective crime prevention that protected community safety and democratic institutions against systematic threats from organized crime and official corruption, that required continued vigilance and citizen participation in governmental oversight and accountability measures. The progress that was achieved through elimination of criminal conspiracy and implementation of honest governance provided foundation for continued territorial development and democratic institutions that could serve community welfare through constitutional authority and legitimate political process that protected citizen rights and promoted social progress, while successful federal intervention demonstrated capability for addressing systematic corruption and organized crime that threatened democratic governance throughout frontier regions. 10 years after discovering the bloodstained letter that exposed Sheriff Rousseau's criminal conspiracy, Marshal Lucien Beaumont stood in the same jail cell where Claude Thibodaux had died, protecting the truth that would ultimately destroy the organized crime that had systematically corrupted territorial law enforcement and threatened democratic governance throughout Esperanza County. The bronze plaque that now marked the cell commemorated the prisoner's sacrifice and the federal investigation that had eliminated systematic corruption while restoring constitutional law enforcement and community trust in governmental institutions, whose reform had enabled territorial development and democratic progress that served citizen welfare rather than criminal interests. The law enforcement academy that had been established through federal funding and community support was graduating officers whose training emphasized constitutional principles and ethical responsibility that prevented corruption through systematic education about public service and citizen rights, that democratic governance required from officials whose authority served community welfare rather than personal advancement or criminal enterprise that threatened legitimate governmental institutions. The curriculum included detailed study of Rousseau case as example of how systematic corruption could infiltrate law enforcement while demonstrating investigative techniques and federal cooperation that could expose and eliminate organized crime. The community prosperity that had flourished following elimination of criminal conspiracy included legitimate business development and social institutions that provided foundation for family welfare and educational opportunity that honest governance could support through constitutional authority and effective law enforcement that protected citizen rights and community safety against systematic predation by organized crime, whose prevention required continued vigilance and commitment to democratic principles that served public welfare rather than private criminal interests that threatened territorial development and constitutional governance. The family that Lucien and Elizabeth had raised included children whose education emphasized moral courage and civic responsibility that democratic society required from citizens whose participation in governmental oversight and community service could prevent future development of systematic corruption and organized crime through early detection and citizen resistance to official misconduct and criminal infiltration of legitimate institutions whose effectiveness depended on public trust and constitutional accountability that honest officials provided through commitment to public welfare. The truth that had been preserved through Thibodaux's dying testimony continued inspiring law enforcement officers and community leaders whose dedication to constitutional principles and effective crime prevention protected democratic institutions against systematic threats from organized crime and official corruption. While the precedent that had been established through successful federal intervention created framework for addressing similar threats to territorial governance and citizen welfare throughout frontier regions, where democratic development required federal protection and community commitment to honest administration that served constitutional authority rather than criminal enterprise. As sunset painted the territorial landscape that had been transformed from criminal-controlled territory into prosperous democratic community, the memorial in Thibodaux's honor reflected light that seemed to carry the enduring message that truth would always triumph over systematic corruption when courage met opportunity and individual sacrifice served divine justice that protected innocent citizens from organized evil. While the blood-stained letter that had started everything remained preserved in federal archives as testament to power of truth and evidence that one prisoner's dying courage could expose criminal conspiracy and restore democratic governance to communities whose freedom depended on citizens brave enough to risk everything for constitutional principles and strong enough to build futures worthy of the magnificent sacrifice that transformed criminal corruption into honest law enforcement in territories where justice rode with those determined enough to preserve evidence and courageous enough to trust federal intervention for protecting democratic institutions against domestic enemies whose power could threaten constitutional government unless systematic resistance and legal prosecution eliminated criminal organizations through constitutional means that preserved democratic values while ensuring community safety and territorial development that served citizen welfare rather than criminal exploitation of public trust and governmental authority.